The man who demoted me for having a bad attitude never expected I'd be the one to expose him for stealing from the company. He thought he'd buried my career, but I buried his instead. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. I still remember the day I was told I was being reassigned. It was delivered so politely, in that sterile HR tone that sounds like empathy but feels like dismissal. They said it wasn't a punishment, just a temporary adjustment because of my attitude. That word stung. Attitude. It wasn't my performance, not my numbers, not even my punctuality. It was my attitude. The word hung in my mind for weeks, echoing every time I sat at my new desk, a smaller one, tucked in a corner, far from the window I'd once earned after years of dedication. At first, I told myself to breathe, to let it pass. But every time my manager, Mark, walked by with that smug little grin, I felt something inside me tighten, because I knew why I'd really been demoted. I knew what he'd done, and what he thought he'd gotten away with. Mark wasn't just a bad boss. He was a thief, the kind who smiled through every lie and expected the world to nod along. I'd caught him fabricating expense reports, slipping in fake hotel stays and luxury dinners under the guise of client relations. He thought I'd stay quiet, and maybe, at first, I would have, if he hadn't turned around and made me the problem. You see, I've always believed in rules, not because I'm naive, but because they keep people like Mark from turning workplaces into playgrounds for greed. So when he told me to approve an expense report that didn't have the required receipts, I hesitated. Just a pause. Just a simple, professional question. Hey, Mark, do you have the backup documentation for this one? He laughed, actually laughed, and said, "You're overthinking it. Just process it like everyone else does." But I wasn't everyone else. I had a career built on precision and ethics. My signature meant something, and I wasn't about to stamp it on a lie. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the conversation in my head, wondering if I'd overreacted. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was just being difficult. But by morning, the unease hadn't faded. It had calcified. Then 2 days later, HR called me in. The woman sitting across from me had a clipboard and the kind of sympathetic smile that tells you bad news is coming. She said there had been a complaint about my negative attitude and inflexibility toward leadership. Mark's words. Almost verbatim. I felt my stomach drop, but I kept my face still. Years in corporate life teach you that silence is sometimes your only defense. They said they'd be temporarily reassigning me to data entry while they evaluated the team dynamic. I wanted to laugh, to ask if they'd even looked at my performance record, at the hours I'd put in, at the clean audits I'd led. But I didn't. I just nodded, signed the form, and walked out. That night, I sat in my car in the parking lot long after everyone else had gone home. I stared at the lights of the building, the one where I'd worked for nearly a decade, and wondered how someone like Mark could twist the truth so easily. There's a kind of ache that comes with injustice. It's not loud. It's not even hot. It's this cold, steady weight in your chest that settles there and refuses to leave. I felt it growing inside me, heavier with each passing day. At first, I told myself I'd just endure it. People like Mark always trip eventually, I thought. But then, I watched him walk past my new cubicle one afternoon, holding a stack of fresh expense reports, all with the same inflated totals, all lacking receipts. and I realized he wasn't going to trip. Not unless I made him. He thought he'd silenced me. He thought that demoting me would make me disappear, that I'd shrink back into obedience and forget what I'd seen. But if there's one thing I've learned in life, it's that the quiet ones are the ones you should never underestimate. I didn't know how yet. I didn't have a plan. But in that moment, I made myself a promise. If Mark wanted to play dirty, I was going to play smart, and one day soon, he was going to regret ever using that word. Attitude. Asterisk before everything fell apart. My work life had a rhythm that felt almost comforting. I had been with the company for 8 years, long enough to know every department's quirks, every shortcut in the accounting system, every unspoken rule that made the place run smoothly. I liked that kind of predictability. Numbers were clean, logical. They didn't lie, and they didn't play favorites. That's what drew me to accounting in the first place. It was the one place where integrity wasn't just a word on the wall. It was the foundation of everything we did. When Mark first joined the department as my manager, I actually thought he might bring something fresh. He had this polished energy, always smiling, always cracking a joke. He could make a staff meeting feel like a happy hour. The higher-ups loved him for it. They said he had great leadership potential. At first, I didn't mind his charm. In fact, I thought maybe it would make the team dynamic easier. But over time, I started noticing little things. The kind of details most people would overlook, like how Mark would hand off his routine reports to other people but still present the results to the directors as if they were his own. Or how he'd praise someone in front of others, only to quietly criticize them in private later. It wasn't loud manipulation. It was subtle, like a slow leak you don't notice until the floor is already flooded. The first real warning sign came during our quarterly review cycle. I was compiling expense data for our client-facing teams, and I noticed a few entries under Mark's account that didn't make sense. There was a hotel charge in Chicago, but we didn't have any clients there. Then a client dinner receipt at a restaurant that didn't even match our corporate policy. When I brought it up casually, Mark waved his hand and said, "Oh, that was a cross-department thing. Don't worry about it." I let it go that first time. I told myself maybe I just didn't have all the context. It happens. But as the months passed, I kept finding more of those cross-department charges. More vague entries with no backup, no receipts, no clear justification. Sometimes they were small, a few $100s here and there. Other times, they were in the thousands. The thing is, when you work in accounting long enough, you develop a sixth sense for patterns. And Mark's reports weren't just sloppy, they were strategic. He knew exactly how to keep them just low enough to slip past scrutiny, just ordinary enough to blend in with legitimate expenses. I remember once staying late to finish an audit check when Mark stopped by my desk. Everyone else had gone home, and the office was quiet except for the hum of the fluorescent lights. He leaned on the cubicle wall, casual as ever, and said, "You work too hard. You know that. You need to learn to let the small stuff go." I looked up from my screen. "I just don't like discrepancies," I said. He smiled, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "Discrepancies," he repeated softly, as if testing the word. "Well, let's make sure those discrepancies don't make life harder for anyone who doesn't deserve it." "Yeah." Then he tapped my desk and walked away. It was subtle, but I heard what he meant. It wasn't advice. It was a warning. That night, I sat in my car again before driving home, gripping the steering wheel while the office lights flickered off behind me. I'd always believed in keeping things professional, that if you did your job well, people respected that. But with Mark, The rules didn't seem to apply. He didn't want a competent employee. He wanted compliance. Still, I tried to keep my head down. I told myself to stay professional, not to make enemies. I started avoiding direct confrontation with him and just focused on my work. But it was hard to ignore how quickly things changed in our department after that. Mark began surrounding himself with a small group of people who laughed at his jokes, backed him in meetings, and conveniently forgot to question anything he signed off on. They were rewarded with longer breaks, flexible hours, and extra perks. Meanwhile, I was slowly being edged out of projects I'd once led. My responsibilities were quietly reassigned. Emails I used to be CC'd on stopped including me. That it wasn't an accident. It was a strategy. I could see it happening in real time, but without proof. I couldn't call it out by then. I had stopped seeing Mark as just a bad boss. He was something worse. A manipulator who knew how to weaponize the system itself. And still, I held on to the hope that doing the right thing would matter. That the truth, if it ever came to light, would speak for itself. I just didn't realize how far Mark was willing to go to protect his own lies. Because when he finally crossed the line, it wasn't subtle at all. That it was deliberate, calculated, and personal. The day everything truly began unraveling started like any other. A quiet Monday morning, the kind where the coffee tastes burnt, the office air feels still, and everyone moves a little slower than usual. I was sitting at my desk, double-checking vendor payments, when Mark appeared at the corner of my cubicle, leaning casually against the partition like he owned the place. He always did that, stood too close, spoke too softly, and smiled just a little too wide. "Got a few expense reports that need your approval," he said, dropping a stack of papers on my desk. "Shouldn't take long." I nodded automatically, but when I flipped through the reports, something caught my eye almost immediately. There were 3 entries under Mark's name: hotel stays, car rentals, and a few pricey restaurant tabs. But all of them were missing the one thing our system absolutely required: receipts. "Mark," I said, keeping my tone even, "I can't approve these without documentation." He waved a hand, dismissing my concern like it was a fly buzzing around his head. "Don't overthink it, okay? These are standard. You know how client trips go. Sometimes receipts get misplaced. Just process them like everyone else does." I looked up at him. "But we have rules for a reason." "If there's an audit," he interrupted me with a smirk. "If there's an audit, I'll handle it. Trust me, no one's losing sleep over a few dinners." The way he said it, casual, confident, like he'd done this 100 times before, made my stomach twist. This wasn't carelessness. It was routine. I pushed the stack of papers back toward him. "I'm sorry, but I can't sign off on these without proof. That's policy." For a moment, his smile faltered. Then he leaned down, resting his hands on my desk so we were eye level. "You know," he said quietly, "I like you, but sometimes you make things harder than they need to be." It wasn't a compliment. It was a threat wrapped in charm. I held his gaze. "Doing my job isn't hard, Mark. Ignoring it would be." He stared at me for a beat, his eyes narrowing just slightly before straightening up and chuckling. "Suit yourself," he said, scooping up the papers. "But don't say I didn't warn you." I thought that was the end of it. Just another tense exchange. I couldn't have been more wrong. 2 days later, I got an email from HR. The subject line read, "Meeting request. Discussion regarding workplace conduct." I remember rereading the subject line, feeling my pulse start to climb. I had never, not once in my entire career, been called into HR for anything negative. My record was spotless. When I walked into the room, Mark was already there, sitting across from our HR representative with his hands folded neatly in front of him. He smiled when I entered. That same infuriatingly calm expression that told me he'd been planning this. The HR rep gestured for me to sit. "We've received some feedback about team morale," she began. "There have been reports of friction, particularly concerning your interactions with management." My heart sank. I knew where this was going. "Specifically," she continued, "there have been concerns that you've been resistant to instructions, creating tension within the department." Mark mentioned a few instances where you refused to follow standard procedures. "Standard procedures?" I repeated, incredulous. "I refused to approve reports that didn't have proper documentation. That's company policy." Mark leaned forward slightly, his voice calm and measured. "No one's questioning your dedication," he said. "It's just about your tone. You've been coming across as, well, negative. It's affecting the team's atmosphere." I stared at him. Negative. That word again. As if integrity could be rebranded as insubordination with enough confidence. I turned to HR. "I've always followed procedure. If doing that is considered negative, then I'm not sure what's left to discuss." The HR rep offered that same neutral smile that meant the decision had already been made. "We're going to reassign you temporarily," she said gently, "just to give everyone some space to recalibrate. You'll still receive your regular pay." It was meant to sound like a compromise, but I knew what it was. A demotion, plain and simple. When the meeting ended, Mark stood and placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't take it personally," he said, in that smooth, patronizing tone of his. "Sometimes attitude matters more than accuracy." I felt my whole body go still, my jaw clenched, my hands tightening around my folder. But I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself to. As I walked back to my desk, the office suddenly felt different, smaller, colder. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, too artificial. My co-workers avoided my eyes. The message was clear. I had been marked. That afternoon, I was escorted to my new workspace, a corner cubicle near the printers, far from my old team. The kind of spot reserved for people they wanted out of sight but not quite gone. I sat there for a long time, staring at the blank monitor, feeling a quiet, burning disbelief. I had done everything right. I'd followed every rule, every policy, every moral line. And yet, somehow, I was the one being punished. It was the moment something inside me shifted. 4 years. I'd believed that doing the right thing was enough. That truth had its own gravity, that it would eventually pull things into balance. But sitting there in that dim cubicle, with the hum of the printer behind me and Mark's laughter echoing faintly from across the office, I realized how wrong I'd been in that moment. I stopped being just an employee who followed the rules. I became someone who would use the rules. And soon enough, they'd be the very thing that took Mark down. Demotion. That word has a sting to it, doesn't it? It's meant to sound clinical, like a harmless reclassification. But what it really means is, we've decided you don't matter as much anymore. In the days following that HR meeting, I felt invisible. The tasks they gave me were tedious. Data entry, basic filing, spreadsheet cleanup, work that didn't require thought, only time. I went from preparing financial audits to checking invoice codes like a trainee. Mark made sure to walk past my desk every day. Sometimes he'd stop to drop off paperwork or make some meaningless comment about team spirit. But most of the time, he didn't have to say a thing. His smirk said it all. "See? You should have listened." I learned quickly that silence was my best weapon. If he thought I was defeated, he'd stop paying attention. And if he stopped paying attention, I could start watching. And watch I did. It didn't take long to see that Mark hadn't just continued his little expense schemes. He'd expanded them. The difference now was that he'd grown smarter. Or so he thought. Instead of submitting everything under his own name, he began filing expenses under team members who didn't even travel. I'd see a report come through for John M. Client meeting, Los Angeles, and I'd glance over to see John sitting 2 desks away, eating lunch out of a paper bag. He was laundering his theft through the people he managed. And the cruelest part, they didn't even know Mark was careful. He'd pull them aside with a friendly smile, saying things like, "Hey, I'll take care of your reimbursements for this quarter. Easier for accounting." They were flattered, even grateful. Meanwhile, he was using their names to bill luxury hotels, car services, and restaurants that had nothing to do with work. And me? I was the only one who could see the pattern, because I was the one quietly inputting all the data. The irony wasn't lost on me. He demoted me to data entry, and that's exactly what gave me access to everything I needed. Still, I had to be careful. If he even suspected I was watching, he'd make sure to bury me for good. So, I kept my head down, pretending to focus on the meaningless numbers while, in reality, I was tracking every one of his lies. Each fraudulent entry was like a breadcrumb, leading me closer to understanding the scale of his theft. And it was bigger than I ever imagined. Over 3 months, Mark siphoned off nearly $20,000 in fake travel expenses. It wasn't just greed. It was arrogance. He believed he was untouchable. And maybe he would have been, if not for one small, careless moment. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, I overheard him in the break room talking to one of his little inner circle favorites. His voice was light, joking, but his words made my stomach twist. "Hey, when you submit that report, make sure you send it through me first," he said. "I'll tweak it so the numbers look clean. Don't want compliance getting curious." The other person laughed, clearly not realizing how serious that was. But I knew. He wasn't just committing expense fraud. He was manipulating company documents to cover it up. That's when something inside me hardened. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about justice. But of course, Mark didn't stop there. The more confident he grew, the bolder he became. He started using his new authority over me as a kind of sport. He'd CC me on condescending emails about team positivity. He'd publicly thank me for my attention to detail, as if mocking the very thing he'd punished me for once. During a staff meeting, he made a point of saying, "We all know the importance of following procedures, right, Lisa?" He always said my name just loud enough for everyone to hear. I smiled politely, but inside, my blood ran cold. The man was taunting me, in plain sight, and getting away with it. But he didn't realize I was already collecting evidence. Slowly, methodically, I started keeping notes, dates, amounts, names, expense codes. Every time he filed something suspicious, I documented it. I even started saving copies of reports before they were processed, printing them quietly and slipping them into a plain folder I kept in my locked drawer. Each sheet of paper felt like another brick in the foundation of something bigger, something inevitable. Still, as careful as I was, the situation was becoming unbearable. Every day felt like walking a tightrope, pretending obedience while resisting the urge to call him out in front of everyone. There's a special kind of exhaustion that comes from knowing the truth and having to act like you don't. It eats at you, day by day, and yet, it also sharpens you. Every smirk, every sarcastic comment, Every meeting where he belittled me in front of others. All of it was fuel. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I was studying him, watching his patterns, his routines, the way he moved through the office, the systems he thought he'd mastered. I knew something he didn't. The higher the stack of lies, the harder the fall. He just hadn't hit the edge yet. But the moment that pushed me from quiet observation to active retaliation, that final shove from frustration into action, was coming soon. And when it did, I wasn't going to just expose him. I was going to make sure he fell by the very rules he thought protected him. It's strange how the smallest moments can change everything. You spend weeks, months, even years putting up with something, convincing yourself you can endure it. And then one sentence, one gesture, one smug look is enough to light the fuse. For me, that moment came on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of day that drags on endlessly, with stale air and the faint hum of office lights that never seemed to turn off. I'd been entering expense records all morning, my eyes aching from staring at spreadsheets that blurred together. Mark had been in and out of meetings all day, his laughter echoing across the hallway. Around mid-afternoon, I heard it again. That easy, confident laugh, followed by a voice I didn't recognize. Curious, I got up to refill my coffee and passed by the break room. That's when I heard him say it. He was talking to one of the regional managers, a man visiting from out of state. Mark was bragging about a conference he'd attended in Miami. He was going on about how networking dinners could be as important as presentations, and how the company was lucky to have someone like him bringing in new leads. Except there had never been a Miami conference. I knew that because I had personally processed the reimbursement for that trip, the one with 5-star hotel charges, rental cars, and room service that could feed an entire family. It was all fake. Every last cent. He wasn't just lying anymore. He was building an entire fantasy, a version of himself that existed on paper and in words, funded by the company's money and shielded by his fake charm. I remember standing there, frozen, coffee cup in hand, listening as he painted himself as the perfect executive. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. He truly believed he was untouchable. Something inside me cracked then, not like an explosion, but like glass finally giving way after months of pressure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about how far he'd gone. He'd stolen from the company, humiliated me, and now he was flaunting his deceit like an achievement. And the worst part, everyone believed him. I tried to push away the bitterness, but it sat heavy in my chest. I thought about the years I'd spent building my reputation on integrity, how hard I'd worked, how quietly I'd sacrificed evenings and weekends just to do things right. And here was this man, who saw rules as obstacles and people as tools, rising higher because of it. The next morning, I walked into the office with a strange sense of calm. Not anger, not even resentment, just a quiet, steady resolve. When I saw him in the hallway, he smiled at me. That same fake friendliness he always wore. "Morning, Lisa," he said. "Ready for another fun day in Dataland?" I looked him straight in the eyes and smiled back. Absolutely. He didn't know it, but something had shifted. I wasn't going to let him humiliate me anymore. I wasn't going to wait for karma to find him. I was going to make sure it did. That afternoon, while sorting through archived expense records, I noticed something I hadn't before. A small line of metadata that appeared whenever a report was uploaded. It listed the IP address of the computer that had submitted it. A thought sparked. I clicked through one of Mark's older expense claims, and there it was. The same company assigned IP address every time. That meant he hadn't been submitting these from home or delegating them. He was doing it right from his office computer. It was like finding his fingerprints at the crime scene. My pulse quickened. I clicked another, then another. Every single fake report traced back to him. The digital trail was undeniable. For the first time in months, I felt something warm in my chest. Hope. I knew then that I had him. I just needed to be methodical, so I started gathering everything. I went through months of records, downloading reports, printing copies, and storing them discreetly at home. I saved the metadata logs, screenshots of email confirmations, and even travel approval forms that didn't align with his fake trips. Every piece of evidence told the same story. Mark had been stealing from the company, under everyone's nose. And the best part, he'd been so arrogant, so sure of his own brilliance, that he'd left a digital paper trail so perfect it practically confessed for him. Still, part of me hesitated. Reporting him meant risking everything. I'd already been branded difficult. What if HR turned it against me again? What if they said I was bitter or vengeful? But the more I thought about it, the less I cared about what they might say. I wasn't doing this for revenge. I was doing it because people like Mark count on silence. They thrive on it. And I refused to be another person who looked the other way. The final straw came the next day. He called me into his office, closing the door behind me. "Lisa," he said, his tone falsely pleasant, "I noticed you've been spending extra time looking at old reports. Everything okay?" My heart thudded, but I kept my expression calm, just catching up on data entries. He tilted his head slightly. "Good. I like when people know their place." That was it. The moment I stopped being afraid as I walked back to my desk, my decision solidified. He wanted me to know my place, and soon, he was going to learn his. Because that line he'd crossed months ago, when he punished me for refusing to lie. It wasn't something I could ever forgive, but it was something I could correct. And I was about to. When I finally accepted that I couldn't simply wait for justice to arrive on its own. The first thing I did was sit very still and breathe. Panic makes people sloppy. I'd spent years building a reputation on calm competence. I wasn't about to throw that away now. So I slowed down. I let my mind move in the opposite direction of Mark's arrogance. Carefully, deliberately, with the kind of patience that turns impatience into proof. The discovery of the IP metadata felt almost accidental. But looking back, I know it was the natural reward of paying attention. You learn to notice patterns in accounting. How numbers line up. How memos are worded. How timestamps fall into place. It's a kind of muscle memory. So when I saw that line of data, the digital equivalent of a fingerprint, it felt less like a clue and more like the crime scene finally opening up. I went home that night and lay awake thinking about chain of custody. In my line of work, evidence is useless if you can't prove it hasn't been tampered with. If I was going to make a case that would stand up to scrutiny, I needed more than suspicion and a handful of screenshots. I needed documents, logs, and context. I needed a paper trail that tied everything together in a way that couldn't be dismissed as coincidence. The first practical step was obvious. Collect everything relevant, without leaving a trace that could be traced back to me. That meant using tools I already had legal access to. Nothing covert, nothing illegal. I had been in accounting long enough to know where archives lived, and how long certain logs were kept. I still had read-only access to some archival folders for quality control reasons. And while they were supposed to be used only for verified audits, they were the perfect place to start. I began by making a list. Dates, expense IDs, vendor names, amounts, the exact language mark used on each submission. For each suspicious entry, I captured the expense form, the attachment status, the approval history, and, most importantly, the metadata showing the submitting IP address and timestamp. Every matching IP pointed back to the same office machine. Every timestamp lined up with work hours when Mark was known to be in his office. Patterns, again. A rhythm that made denial harder. I printed copies. Not all at once. Not in the office printer that everyone used, but few sheets at a time. I folded them into a plain folder and slipped that folder into my bag. At home, I set up a small, secure workspace where I could assemble everything. I labeled documents by date and built a chronological timeline. When you present an investigator with a clean timeline, they don't have to guess. They can follow the sequence like stepping stones. I also backed up the digital records to a new flash drive I bought that weekend. I remember feeling foolish walking out of the store with the kind of small purchase that, once in hand, felt like a piece of armor. I encrypted the drive with a password only I knew and kept it locked in a small safe at home. It was not about paranoia. It was about responsibility. If anyone accused me of tampering, I wanted to be able to show where each copy came from and when I made it. Next came context. Metadata alone would point fingers, but on its own it could be explained away as a misclick or an administrative quirk. So I collected supporting items, travel approval emails that didn't align with actual travel itineraries, calendar invites with no attendees, vendor receipts that didn't match the billed amounts, and hotel folios that listed different names. I pulled email headers that confirmed the routing of approval requests. I even noted employee schedules and travel logs showing that some of the supposed clients were never in the city Mark claimed. I was careful to avoid anything that could be interpreted as me overstepping access privileges. I never used another person's credentials. I never removed or altered files. Everything I gathered was either a copy of what I could legally view, or a printout of what had been processed into the system. The difference mattered, because the moment I crossed a legal or ethical line, my case would be hollow. There was another tactical choice to make: who to tell. HR was the office's default place for interpersonal issues, but Mark had already weaponized HR against me once. The last thing I wanted was for the complaint to be filtered through the same people who had helped him push me into that corner cubicle. Instead, I thought about the people whose job it actually was to investigate financial misconduct, internal audit, compliance, and the finance leadership. Those departments had a mandate to pursue discrepancies without bias, and they reported to executive leaders who could take decisive action. Still, going directly to audit felt risky. It would draw attention. If Mark or his allies caught wind that I was building a case, they might try to sabotage the records or discredit me further. So I planned for stealth. I wrote a concise, factual summary of my findings and organized the evidence folder to be undeniable but professional. No accusatory language, just clear documentation. I used plain labels and neutral phrasing, expense irregularities, supporting documentation. I wanted the materials to speak for themselves. On a quiet Sunday night, after making one final set of copies, I composed an email. I addressed it to the head of internal audit, with discrete copies to the CFO and the compliance officer. I did not CC HR. I attached a cover letter that read like an investigator's brief. Dates, a short explanation of how the evidence was compiled, and a request for a confidential review. One included a note explaining that I preferred anonymity at first, not out of spite, but out of concern for the integrity of the investigation. and the retaliation I had already experienced before sending it. I did one more thing. I tested the presentation. I printed out a mock folder exactly as it would be reviewed and left it on my kitchen table. I sat across from it for a long time, imagining an auditor flipping through the documents, following the metadata trail, and closing the folder with the same kind of sober recognition I felt when I first connected the dots. It felt surreal, like rehearsing an outcome that belonged in someone else's life. But I'd reached a point where rehearsal had to turn into action. I hit send. The email went out with no fanfare. I didn't announce it. I didn't gloat. I sat back and listened to the house. The quiet was oddly loud. For the first time since the demotion, I felt unburdened. Not because I'd struck a blow, but because I'd done the thing that mattered. I had turned suspicion into documentation. I knew there were risks. Mark could figure out that something had been submitted. Audits can take time. There was no quick public spectacle, no immediate satisfaction. In my head, I prepared for the long, slow machinery of corporate investigation. And yet, for all the planning, there was still something simple and almost childlike about the moment. I walked into the office the next morning. I no longer felt small. The plan wasn't glamorous. It was methodical. It relied on patience, not theatrics. It turned the very thing Mark used to hide behind, the company's systems and processes, against him. He had been careful in all the ways that let him sleep at night. Plausible vendors, marginally believable totals, friendly faces to attach his claims to. But he hadn't considered what happens when someone pays attention not to what you say, but to what you leave behind. He hadn't considered that paper and bytes keep time in a way people don't. He hadn't considered that arrogance often shows up as a pattern. And patterns are what I knew how to read, so I waited. Not passively, but with the composed focus of someone who knows the truth and has done the work to prove it. The evidence was ready. The recipients had everything they needed to start an investigation. I had done my part without breaking a rule. Now, the corporate gears would turn. And when they did, I was going to be ready to watch him stumble into the consequences of his own choices. Asterisk, when I walked into the office the morning after I sent the email, I felt oddly calm. The sort of calm that comes from knowing you've set a mechanism in motion and there's no turning back. The folder in my bag felt heavier now, not because of the paper, but because of responsibility. I had done my part, collected, organized, and delivered. The rest would be handled by people whose job it was to follow the trail. I didn't announce anything. I kept the same practiced composure I'd used since day one. Polite greetings, clean work. No dramatics. I filed my timesheet, logged into my computer, and settled into the corner cubicle that had become my unintended vantage point. From there I could see most of the department, Mark's office, the conference room, the line of desks where his allies clustered. Being demoted had the unexpected benefit of making me a better observer. People let their guard down round someone they think doesn't matter. Late that morning, I got a short, formal reply from the head of internal audit. No fanfare, no accusations, just an acknowledgement that they had received my submission and would review the information. Confidentially, it wasn't much, but it was the exact response I had hoped for. Neutral, official, and away from HR's performative diplomacy. Over the next few days, I watched the office like someone watching weather patterns. Auditors don't always arrive in a storm. Sometimes they come in as a quiet, precise rain. A week later, I noticed unfamiliar ID cards at the reception desk. Internal audit and compliance. They weren't ostentatious. They were efficient. Two well-dressed professionals who did not smoke, did not make jokes, and did not need to be introduced. They went straight to Mark's manager to request a confidential meeting. I didn't engage them. I didn't try to push the timeline. I simply continued to follow my usual routine until I saw them head toward Mark's office. That day, Mark left for a meeting and didn't return until late afternoon. When he did come back, he didn't look like the man who had strutted through the halls with a grin. His posture was flat, his smile gone. He walked directly to his desk, packed a few personal items into a small box, and left the building with a security escort. I remember the sound of the elevator closing like the final click in a lock. But I want to be precise here. The climax wasn't a single dramatic moment of me shouting "I told you so" and pointing fingers. It was a sequence of careful, professional steps, the kind I'd always respected. The auditors interviewed people, reviewed logs, and cross-checked vendor invoices. They worked their way through the system, following the metadata trail I had highlighted, corroborating details against access logs and calendar entries. When you let the system speak, it tends to tell the truth. And the system in our company had been very thorough. There was a particular scene that remains vivid. An auditor, a woman with silver hair and a voice that never rose above calm, called me into a small, windowless conference room. Her presence made the room seem orderly, as if her air rearranged the furniture into facts. She asked me factual questions, dates, document IDs, where I had found the IP logs, what copies I had made, and why I had addressed the report to audit instead of HR. I answered simply, without flourish. I told the truth exactly as it happened. She nodded, typed notes, and did not look surprised or scandalized. She looked relieved that someone had compiled the evidence clearly. That relief, oddly, felt like validation. The auditors handled the inquiry with procedural precision. They didn't want vendettas. They wanted files. They requested additional access logs and interviewed IT to confirm that submissions with the same IP really did originate from one specific workstation. IT verified it. Timestamps, login records, and the machine's MAC address all pointed back to Mark's office during business hours. They checked travel card usage and found no corresponding boarding passes or travel reimbursements through legitimate channels. Every layer we had documented held up. Meanwhile, word began to spread, not as gossip but as administrative adjustments. Systems flagged duplicate vendors. Finance froze a few questionable reimbursements. Compliance put holds on expense reimbursements linked to certain approval chains. These actions were quiet and clinical, the opposite of theater. To anyone not directly involved, it might have looked like routine checks. To me, it was the slow, inexorable machine of accountability doing what it was designed to do. One afternoon, I watched Mark pacing in a glass conference room, a figure reduced from swagger to pacing. I could see the outline of his shoulders through the glass, hands moving in small, agitated gestures. From my corner, I imagined his internal monologue, disbelief, bargaining, then the slow realization that charm and bravado don't change a log file. In the end, he did what many people do when the evidence is clear. He tried to explain. He blamed miscommunication, delegated responsibility, and suggested clerical errors. None of it stuck. There was an emotional complexity to those days I hadn't expected. I didn't celebrate in loud ways. I felt relief, yes, but relief mixed with a strange sorrow. It wasn't only about Mark. It was about how easy it had been for one person to bend rules for personal gain. How many small accommodations and polite silences had allowed him to escalate. I thought about the colleagues who'd unknowingly carried his lies, the administrative systems that trusted signatures without scrutiny, and the way workplace cultures can prize congeniality over candor. When the auditors concluded their initial review, they presented the findings to the CFO and compliance. The language of their report was precise and unemotional. Discrepancies identified. Corroborating evidence attached. Recommendations for disciplinary action. The executives moved quickly but quietly. They didn't involve a public announcement. There was no dramatic accusation on the company intranet. Instead, Mark's access was revoked, and he was escorted from the building that afternoon. I learned about it like everyone else, through the hush that falls when a room becomes aware of a change it didn't expect. One memory I keep returning to is how ordinary the moment of his removal felt. No one screamed. No one cheered. People simply continued their work, as if the office itself was taking a small, deep breath and then exhaling. That ordinary reaction felt right. Justice in the workplace isn't about spectacle. It's about restoring trust and function, about clearing the air so the work can proceed without the distortion of theft. There was one small, private satisfaction that I will admit to. The folder on my home desk, the one I had prepared so carefully, was no longer just paperwork. It had become the conduit for truth. Each printed metadata line, each mismatched receipt, once folded and silent, had done its job. They had turned a pattern of deceit into a case that even the most practiced liar couldn't wiggle out of. As for Mark, the fall was precise and tied directly to his actions. He'd used the company systems, during company hours, on company machines. The very tools he believed gave him cover. His arrogance had been his undoing. The trail he left was, in the end, the purest form of confession. The auditors didn't need to catch him in the act. They only needed to follow his footprints. When the dust settled, I resumed my work. Life at the office didn't suddenly become a fairy tale. There were awkward conversations to be had, policy revisions to make, and trust to be rebuilt. But there was also a quiet, restorative clarity, the feeling that truth had been acknowledged and accounted for. The climax of the story was not fireworks. It was the steady application of process, guided by the evidence I had secured and the people who did their jobs without favoritism. And somewhere deep down, I felt a calm satisfaction. I had used the very systems Mark thought protected him. I hadn't stooped to theatrics or slander. I'd done what I always believed mattered. I followed the rules and let the rules do their work. The first time I saw Mark after the investigation began to close in, he looked like a man who had misplaced his confidence somewhere and didn't know how to retrieve it. His suit was the same, tailored, expensive, a shade of blue that used to project control. But it hung differently now, looser somehow, as if he'd lost weight or stopped caring about fit. His usual quick, shallow smile was gone, replaced by something tight and watchful. The confrontation wasn't cinematic. There were no shouting matches or slammed doors. It came in slow, deliberate stages, the way tides erase a footprint grain by grain. One morning, about 2 weeks after the auditors had wrapped up their review, Mark was summoned to the executive conference room. That room wasn't used for casual meetings. It was where decisions were made. Its glass walls had blinds that could be closed, and that morning, for the first time in months, they were. From my corner desk, I watched him walk in with his phone in one hand and his coffee in the other, trying to project his usual swagger. A compliance officer followed, then the CFO. The door shut quietly behind them. The blinds stayed closed for more than an hour. When they finally opened, Mark came out first. His face was pale, his movements brisk. He didn't look at anyone. He went straight to his office, where he stayed for the next 30 minutes with the door shut. When he emerged, he was carrying a single box, his coffee mug, a few framed photos, some papers. His security badge dangled from his fingers, detached from his lanyard. He passed my cubicle without a word, but for the briefest second, his eyes flicked toward me. Just a flicker, almost nothing. But in that moment, something in me recognized that he knew. He knew who had noticed, who had refused to stay silent. The arrogance that had filled every conversation was gone. What was left was raw disbelief, the kind of disbelief people have when they finally realize the world doesn't bend to their self-image. The following Monday, a company-wide email went out. It was brief and sterile, the kind of message written by legal teams. It said Mark had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Everyone knew that phrase was a euphemism. In offices, euphemisms are their own language. Polite veneers over stories everyone half knows but doesn't discuss openly. That afternoon, HR sent another email announcing a temporary leadership transition and introducing an interim manager. People whispered in the break room, trying to connect us, but no one dared to ask me anything directly. Maybe they sensed something. Maybe they were just cautious. Either way, I stayed quiet. My satisfaction didn't need witnesses. A few days later, I was called into a meeting with the CFO and the same silver-haired auditor. They thanked me, formally, but sincerely, for my diligence. The CFO's tone was measured. Your documentation was thorough and extremely helpful. You likely saved the company from a significant compliance issue. Then came the phrase I hadn't expected. We're reinstating your position, with back pay. Effective immediately. I remember nodding, almost numb. Relief didn't come as a rush. It came as stillness. After months of humiliation, long nights, and quiet fear, I could finally exhale. Justice didn't roar. It sighed. The auditor gave me a small smile as I stood to leave. You were very careful, she said. That's rare. Most people wait until they're angry to act, and by then, they lose precision. Her words stayed with me. They described exactly what I'd learned. That justice isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about patience and proof. About letting truth do its slow, deliberate work until denial has nowhere left to hide. I didn't see Mark again for several months. Not until a mutual acquaintance mentioned him at a conference. Apparently, he tried to get a new job at another firm, but his references had raised concerns. The phrase made me smile inwardly. It was polite corporate language for his record followed him. The irony was rich. He had built his career on fake expense reports, on buying prestige with stolen funds. And now the thing he had manipulated for personal gain had destroyed his credibility entirely. No company wanted to hire an executive with a reputation for irregularities in financial reporting. His arrogance had trapped him in the cage he built himself. The few who had once idolized him at work started quietly rewriting their memories, as people do. They began recalling odd behavior or small red flags they'd ignored. Everyone likes to believe they saw the truth coming, even when they didn't. I didn't correct them. It wasn't about me being right anymore. It was about balance being restored. But one last encounter etched itself into my mind. A month after his dismissal, I ran into him by chance at a coffee shop near the office. It was early morning, and the place was half empty. He was standing by the counter, waiting for his order, scrolling on his phone. When he looked up and saw me, his face changed. Not dramatically, just enough to show recognition and a trace of bitterness. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to say something. Then he gave a short, tight smile. "Guess you got what you wanted," he said quietly. I met his gaze, calm and steady. "No," I said. "I got what was fair." He looked away first. When he left, he didn't look back. It wasn't triumph I felt then. It was something quieter and more profound. A confirmation that the world still had order, even if it took effort to maintain it. That small encounter was the real confrontation. Not loud or cruel, but deeply human. I didn't need to gloat. The truth had already done the talking for me from that day forward. Whenever I walked past his old office, now occupied by someone earnest and competent, I felt a small, steady warmth inside me. The kind of warmth that doesn't burn. It just glows. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. The first time I saw Mark after the investigation began to close in, he looked like a man who had misplaced his confidence somewhere and didn't know how to retrieve it. His suit was the same, tailored, expensive, a shade of blue that used to project control. But it hung differently now, looser somehow, as if he'd lost weight or stopped caring about fit. His usual quick, shallow smile was gone, replaced by something tight and watchful. The confrontation wasn't cinematic. There were no shouting matches or slammed doors. It came in slow, deliberate stages, the way tides erase a footprint grain by grain. One morning, about 2 weeks after the auditors had wrapped up their review, Mark was summoned to the executive conference room. That room wasn't used for casual meetings. It was where decisions were made. Its glass walls had blinds that could be closed, and that morning, for the first time in months, they were. From my corner desk, I watched him walk in with his phone in one hand and his coffee in the other, trying to project his usual swagger. A compliance officer followed, then the CFO. The door shut quietly behind them. The blinds stayed closed for more than an hour. When they finally opened, Mark came out first. His face was pale, his movements brisk. He didn't look at anyone. He went straight to his office, where he stayed for the next 30 minutes with the door shut. When he emerged, he was carrying a single box, his coffee mug, a few framed photos, some papers. His security badge dangled from his fingers, detached from his lanyard. He passed my cubicle without a word, but for the briefest second, his eyes flicked toward me. Just a flicker, almost nothing. But in that moment, something in me recognized that he knew. He knew who had noticed, who had refused to stay silent. The arrogance that had filled every conversation was gone. What was left was raw disbelief. The kind of disbelief people have when they finally realize the world doesn't bend to their self-image. The following Monday, a company-wide email went out. It was brief and sterile, the kind of message written by legal teams. It said Mark had resigned to pursue other opportunities. Everyone knew that phrase was a euphemism. In offices, euphemisms are their own language. Polite veneers over stories everyone half knows but doesn't discuss openly. That afternoon, HR sent another email announcing a temporary leadership transition and introducing an interim manager. People whispered in the break room, trying to connect, but no one dared to ask me anything directly. Maybe they sensed something. Maybe they were just cautious. Either way, I stayed quiet. My satisfaction didn't need witnesses. A few days later, I was called into a meeting with the CFO and the same silver-haired auditor. They thanked me, formally, but sincerely, for my diligence. The CFO's tone was measured. Your documentation was thorough and extremely helpful. You likely saved the company from a significant compliance issue. Then came the phrase I hadn't expected. We're reinstating your position, with back pay. Effective immediately. I remember nodding, almost numb. Relief didn't come as a rush. It came as stillness. After months of humiliation, long nights, and quiet fear, I could finally exhale. Justice didn't roar. It sighed. The auditor gave me a small smile as I stood to leave. "You were very careful," she said. "That's rare. Most people wait until they're angry to act, and by then, they lose precision." Her words stayed with me. They described exactly what I'd learned. That justice isn't always about confrontation. Sometimes it's about patience and proof. About letting truth do its slow, deliberate work until denial has nowhere left to hide. I didn't see Mark again for several months. Not until a mutual acquaintance mentioned him at a conference. Apparently, he'd tried to get a new job at another firm, but his references had raised concerns. The phrase made me smile inwardly. It was polite corporate language for his record followed him. The irony was rich. He had built his career on fake expense reports, on buying prestige with stolen funds. And now the thing he had manipulated for personal gain had destroyed his credibility entirely. No company wanted to hire an executive with a reputation for irregularities in financial reporting. His arrogance had trapped him in the cage he built himself. The few who had once idolized him at work started quietly rewriting their memories. As people do, they began recalling odd behavior or small red flags they'd ignored. Everyone likes to believe they saw the truth coming, even when they didn't. I didn't correct them. It wasn't about me being right anymore. It was about balance being restored. But one last encounter etched itself into my mind. A month after his dismissal, I ran into him by chance at a coffee shop near the office. It was early morning, and the place was half empty. He was standing by the counter, waiting for his order, scrolling on his phone. When he looked up and saw me, his face changed. Not dramatically, just enough to show recognition and a trace of bitterness. He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to say something. Then he gave a short, tight smile. "Guess you got what you wanted," he said quietly. I met his gaze, calm and steady. "No," I said. "I got what was fair." He looked away first. When he left, he didn't look back. It wasn't triumph I felt then. It was something quieter and more profound. A confirmation that the world still had order, even if it took effort to maintain it. That small encounter was the real confrontation. Not loud or cruel, but deeply human. I didn't need to gloat. The truth had already done the talking for me from that day forward. Whenever I walked past his old office, now occupied by someone earnest and competent, I felt a small, steady warmth inside me. The kind of warmth that doesn't burn. It just glows. Because justice, when it finally arrives, doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be seen. When justice finally arrives, it rarely announces itself with trumpets. It slips in quietly, changes the air, and lets you notice the difference on your own. That's how it felt the day everything became official. The day I saw the email that confirmed what I already knew in my bones. Mark's resignation was no longer just internal gossip or polite phrasing. It was now public record. The message came through from the compliance department. It wasn't addressed to me personally, but I was CC'd as part of the accounting team. It was a simple update about policy enforcement and financial integrity initiatives. Buried in the second paragraph was the line, "Following a completed internal investigation, the company has terminated the employment of a senior manager due to verified falsification of financial documents and expense reporting." There it was, no name, but everyone knew who it meant. The words were precise, deliberate, and irreversible. Terminated, not resigned, not moved. Not transferred, terminated for cause. I stared at the screen for a long time, letting the quiet weight of those words sink in. After all the gaslighting, the humiliation, the whispered accusations about my attitude, I finally had something tangible, an acknowledgement that the truth had prevailed. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just sat there with my hands resting on the keyboard, breathing evenly. It wasn't joy I felt. It was equilibrium. That afternoon, people started murmuring in hushed voices again. But this time the tone was different. It wasn't gossip laced with mockery or skepticism. It was quiet respect. Some even glanced my way with that hesitant, meaningful look people give when they're not sure if they should apologize. I didn't hold grudges. Most of them had been afraid to cross mark, and fear makes cowards of good people. A few hours later, I was called into the CFO's office again. He handed me a formal letter, a permanent reinstatement of my senior accountant position, complete with a salary correction and a small performance bonus. "Consider this a recognition of your integrity," he said. "It's not often that someone does the right thing knowing it could cost them their job." I thanked him quietly. As I walked out, I passed the conference room where I'd first overheard Mark bragging about his fake Miami trip. The room was empty now, just the hum of the lights and the faint smell of coffee lingering in the air. For the first time, I could walk past it without that cold knot in my stomach. Later that week, I found myself staying late at the office, not out of obligation, but because I wanted to. I pulled up one of our new compliance reports, the updated version that now included automated IP tracking and cross-referenced receipts. The system had been overhauled to prevent exactly the kind of fraud Mark had gotten away with for so long. In a strange way, my ordeal had led to real change. That thought brought me a quiet pride that no award or title ever could. Around 7 p.m., when the building was nearly empty, I went into Mark's old office. It was being cleared for a new hire, but his nameplate was still on the door. I stood there for a moment, looking around at the space that used to intimidate me, the one that had been used to belittle and control me. Without the photos, the flashy trophies, or the expensive coffee machine, it looked smaller, just an ordinary room. I remember walking around the desk and sitting briefly in the chair he'd once used to demote me. The leather creaked under my weight. I rested my hands on the armrests and let myself feel the memory of that day, the smug tone in his voice, the satisfaction he'd taken in cutting me down. Then I whispered, almost to the empty air, "I guess we both found out what attitude really means." I didn't linger. I stood, left the office, and shut the door behind me. Not with anger, not with triumph, just closure. That night, when I got home, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city was glowing with its usual rhythm of lights and movement. I thought about how small choices can build entire destinies. How one decision to speak up, one refusal to be complicit, can ripple outward until it changes the course of something larger than yourself. Somewhere out there, Mark was probably dealing with the aftermath of his own choices, explaining to recruiters, dodging questions, maybe realizing too late that charm doesn't rewrite records. I didn't need to know the details. The beauty of true justice is that it doesn't require an audience. It simply exists. Before going to bed, I opened my work laptop one last time. I saw the compliance update again, the words terminated for falsification, and saved a copy of the email. Not for revenge, but as a reminder that doing the right thing might cost you comfort, but it never costs you integrity. I closed the laptop, finished my wine, and felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace, not victory. Peace, the kind that comes when the truth stands on its own, unshaken, and you realize you never needed to raise your voice to be heard. Time has a way of sanding down sharp edges. Weeks turned into months, and the intensity of it all began to fade into something softer. Not forgotten, but settled. The office returned to its usual hum. New faces arrived, old ones drifted away, and life moved forward. But for me, it was more than just business as usual. It was a quiet transformation after Mark's termination. The entire department underwent a subtle cultural shift. Meetings were calmer, reports were checked more carefully, and perhaps most importantly, people spoke to each other with more respect. The tension that had once been so thick, that silent fear of saying the wrong thing, had lifted. I noticed small things at first. Colleagues who used to keep their heads down during discussions started sharing ideas again. The junior analysts who had always looked nervous around Mark were now confident enough to present their own findings. There was laughter in the break room again. It was almost surreal to realize how much one person's toxicity had infected the whole environment, and how quickly the atmosphere changed once it was gone. As for me, I didn't rush to fill Mark's shoes or climb back into a position of authority. I was content where I was, in control of my own work, respected and unafraid. I'd earned something far more valuable than a title: credibility. Still, one morning a few months later, the CFO stopped by my desk. He was brief, as always, but his words stayed with me. "You were right to speak up," he said. "Most people wouldn't have." I didn't know how to respond, so I just nodded. Sometimes acknowledgement is enough. That night, as I walked out of the building, I paused by the glass doors. The reflection staring back at me wasn't the same woman who had once been humiliated and demoted for having a bad attitude. That woman had doubted herself, tried to appease someone who thrived on control. The woman standing here now carried herself differently, not arrogant, but anchored. It struck me then how easily people misuse words like attitude. For Mark, it had meant defiance, a refusal to be intimidated. But what it truly meant was backbone, the courage to hold your ground even when you're standing alone. Not long after, I was invited to help revise our internal ethics training. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sitting in a meeting room, designing slides about accountability and transparency, I felt an unexpected satisfaction. I wasn't just part of the cleanup. I was helping build safeguards to prevent another Mark from happening again. Outside of work, I started sleeping better. I reconnected with friends I'd been avoiding, embarrassed by how consumed I'd become by the whole ordeal. When I told them what had happened, the demotion, the fake expenses, the investigation, they were shocked. But when I explained how it ended, the reactions were unanimous. "That's karma," one of them said with a grin. I smiled. "Yeah," I said, "it is. But it wasn't just karma. It was cause and effect. A series of choices, his and mine, colliding in a way that couldn't have ended any other way." Months later, I heard through a former co-worker that Mark had been blacklisted from several firms in the region. Word about his expense fraud had spread, and in the tight-knit corporate world, reputations travel fast. Apparently, he'd tried to start his own consulting business, but clients were hesitant. Nobody wanted to work with someone with financial misconduct on their record. I didn't gloat when I heard that. Honestly, I felt a little sorry for him, not because he didn't deserve it. He absolutely did, but because he'd thrown away so much for so little. All that intelligence, all that ambition, wasted on deceit. He could have been successful the right way, but he wanted shortcuts, admiration without integrity, power without accountability. And me? I learned that integrity is the one thing you can't fake your way through. It's quiet, steady, and sometimes lonely, but it lasts. Now, years later, when I tell this story, People always ask me if I'd do it again, knowing the stress, the risk, the emotional toll it took. My answer is always the same. Yes, because the alternative, staying silent, letting someone like that win, would have eroded something inside me that no paycheck could ever repair. I don't look for justice anymore the way I used to. I don't chase it. I just live by it, trusting that the truth eventually surfaces, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully, but always inevitably. There's peace in that understanding. The peace that comes from knowing that I didn't have to become cruel to fight cruelty. That I didn't have to stoop to deceit to defeat a liar. That I could walk away with my head held high and my conscience clear. I've been promoted twice since then, not because I played politics, but because I kept showing up, doing my work, mentoring others, and proving that integrity isn't weakness. It's strength in its purest form. Sometimes, when I stay late in the office and the building grows quiet, I catch my reflection in the window. A woman who once was underestimated, now steady and sure. And every time I think about Mark, I don't feel anger or triumph anymore. Just a quiet lesson learned that actions, good or bad, always return to their source. That honesty might not make you rich, but it keeps you whole. And that the best revenge, the truest kind, is living a life that no one can question. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.